I don't understand why it's so complicated for people to understand it. You see it if you open your eyes.
Yeah, I mean, it's a pretty good standard to tell if a country's doing well is if people are fleeing from it or to it, right?
Let's go.
Welcome to Citizen. We have a special guest today, Dr. Rainer Zitelmann. You're an author and you appear to be very pro-capitalist. Is that right?
Yes, this is okay. I wrote several books, like, for example, In Defense of Capitalism or The Power of Capitalism, and now my new book, How Nations Escape Poverty.
How Nations Escape Poverty. That's really interesting. How Nations Escape Poverty. I've got that book around here somewhere. Somebody sent it to me. So before we get into all of that, let's talk about your background a little bit. So you were born in Frankfurt, Germany, and you're a historian, sociologist, so on. Tell me about your early life growing up and then your education and how you got into the business of, I guess, defending capitalism.
Yes, I was very early in my life interested in politics, even with 8 years, what sounds a little bit crazy, but this is true. But at this time, I was very left-leaning, like a lot of young people. When I was 13 years, I founded a Maoist group at my school and edited a Maoist paper with 13 years. And it was maybe a 10-year period being left-leaning. And then I studied history, and my first doctoral dissertation was about Adolf Hitler. It's published last year in the United States in a new edition. It's Hitler's National Socialism. And one of the results of my dissertation was that Hitler was much more anti-capitalist and socialist than most people admit. And so I started to see that all these Marxist theories about so-called fascism are totally wrong. And this was a part of why I moved away from this left. I saw that the theories are definitely wrong. Yes, and today I wrote now, my new book is book number 29. And what I did, I traveled in the last 20 months to 30 countries all over the world, Asia, Latin America, was also very often in the United States and a lot of European countries. And not only to promote my books, but to promote this message that capitalism is not the problem, but capitalism is the solution for a lot of problems that we have today.
What do you think it was about Maoism that was attractive to you when you were younger?
Okay, there are a lot of young people who are very left-leaning. They look for perfect society, and it's a kind of rebellion against the parents. My parents were also more left-leaning, but of course not so radical. And to have some challenge or protest against the parents, I would have either to come extreme far right or to become extreme far left. And I became extreme far left. And why Maoist? Because, I come from Germany. We were a divided country with East Germany socialism and West Germany capitalism. And of course, we saw that this is not a good system there. It was not far away from us. It was the other part of Germany. So we thought in China it's perfect. Of course, we knew absolutely nothing about the reality of China, what was really terrible, especially at this time when I was young. We had only this propaganda newspapers from China. This was our vision, a country far away. You don't know anything about it, only this utopia. Then you can project all what you think how a society should be, a just society in this.
And then you start studying a bit more about history, and that's when things start to unravel a bit from that perspective, right?
Yes, especially that I mentioned my doctoral dissertation about Adolf Hitler. I was the first one in the world to read all 100% of Adolf Hitler's speeches, even his table talks and conversations with other people, with other politicians, and he wrote 2 books. And a lot of articles, essays. I analyzed it to find out how he thought, and especially in about the economy and about social questions. And I saw that he was much more left-leaning than most people think. Of course, he didn't want to nationalize all means of production like traditional socialism, but he he said it in one speech. I tell the companies, the entrepreneurs, you have to do this and that and that. And if they do it, it's fine, and I don't have to do it. And if they don't do it, the government will do it. So this was his philosophy. And so I thought that the classical leftist or Marxist interpretation of fascism as a dictatorship of the monopoly capital, or that Hitler was even a lackey of the capitalists, that it's totally wrong. No, it was a movement in a way very similar to the communist movement. And by the way, he admired Stalin, he admired the communist movement. He wanted to do something similar, more successful, but these were twin brothers in a way. National Socialism on the one hand and Marxism on the other hand. And this was what I learned when I studied. You can read it all in my book, Hitler's National Socialism. And this was one reason why not the only one, of course, but this was an important point why I changed my political views.
So, I mean, a lot of people would answer the question, what motivated Hitler, by saying he was just a megalomaniac, anti-Semitic person, right? Anti-Semitism, the hatred of Jews drove his, I guess, let's say, foreign and domestic policy. But that doesn't appear to be exactly true, right, from your research.
Of course, he was an anti-Semit, and anti-Semitism and hatred against the Jews and anti-capitalism were very close linked, because he saw the capitalism also as a form or a version of dictatorship of Jewish people. And so, anti-Semitism and anti-capitalism have always the same roots. This is envy against the rich and envy against the successful people. You can see today at the universities in the United States or in Europe, where you have all this pro-Palestine and anti-Israel protesters. These are all left-leaning people, far left, and their anti-capitalism and anti-Semitism is very close. And this is also in history. What also a lot of people don't know, that Karl Marx, in spite of the fact that he was himself Jewish, he was also an anti-Semit, Karl Marx. And you have a long tradition from anti-capitalism and anti-Semitism.
Sure. I mean, Stalin wasn't a friend of the Jews either, frankly. I mean, if you look at
especially at the end of the life, she started to go against the Jews. And Hitler, he admired Stalin. He said in the beginning, this was what Hitler thought, that Stalin was very close linked with Jewish people, but later on that Stalin became something different, like a new Tsar or something like a nationalist, and not any longer lackey from Jewish people as he thought before. So yes, that's absolutely true for Stalin, and Hitler liked it.
So there are a lot of people who are, let's call them severely unqualified to have this conversation out in the public space, having this conversation right now. You're an expert. I wonder, from your perspective, what does the word nationalism really mean? Because right now it seems like a pejorative term that most people use, like, oh, he's a nationalist. And from my perspective, it seems like caring about and prioritizing your own country would be a good idea. But there's a pathological way to go about that too, which is xenophobic and stuff like that. So I wonder, from your perspective, what is at its core, what does nationalism really mean?
Well, yes, of course, it's exactly our seat as your seat. They are so healthy, and I think for every country, people in every country. I've been in the last 20 months in 30 countries all over the world, and in most countries, people are proud about their country, proud to be Spanish, proud to be American, proud to be Polish or German, and I think this is nothing bad as long as it is not aggressive against other nations. This kind of having I don't, maybe I don't call it nationalism, but I think this is something natural that loving your own country, or should be. Of course, there are a lot of young leftist people who hate their own country. This is part of a problem. They hate America, for example. But of course, usually people should love their own country, and this doesn't mean that they hate other nations and other countries. But for Hitler, nationalism means something different. Hitler said one time in his speech, in one of his speeches, that nationalism and socialism is the same in the end, because this means the priority, it should be everything for, in German, there was the saying, Gemeinnutz vor Eigennutz. This means common good before individual good. It means the individual is nothing and your people is everything. And this was his philosophy. They had also one slogan, the National Socialists, it's Du bist nichts, dein Volk ist alles. It means you are nothing and your people is everything. And this was what he meant with nationalism, so a kind of collectivism where the individual is absolutely zero.
There's an old saying, when the state is large, the citizen is small. And that's something that I think that, like, I would consider myself, I guess, a small L libertarian. I don't get involved with party politics, but I do believe in, my North Star is always individual liberty, right? I think that's an important part of American culture.
Oh, this is, yes, and this is what made America great in the past. Capitalism, individual freedom, these are the sources, not the government, of course. I think the problem today is that the state is much too strong in areas where the state should be weak. For example, especially in the economy. And on the other hand, in some areas, especially here in Europe, the state is also too weak where it should be strong. For example, defense. We spend not enough money for our defense here in Europe. We relied always on the United States that they will do it for us. And so my statement here is the state is too strong where the state should be weak, and the state is in some areas too weak. For example, defense, where it should be strong. This is the problem today. And what you said about libertarian ideas, the roots for America are seen. Absolutely, this is the secret that made every country great. My country also, after Second World War, Ludwig Erhard introduced the free market economy, and this made Germany great after the Second World War. But the problem is, after a time, people forget what made their country great. This is the problem in a lot of Western countries today, that the people forgot what made them great.
Yeah, it's interesting. We seem to make a lot of the same mistakes every 25 to 50 years for some reason. And I think a lot of it has to do with people are ignorant, not dumb necessarily, which there are plenty of dumb people, but there are a lot of ignorant people that have no idea what they're talking about. Like we have in the United States this group called Antifa, which is short for anti-fascist, but they have.
I know we have the same in Germany. Yeah. I know. Yes.
Yeah. So you actually, Germany is the only other country I think that they're big in, and it's weird. It's like, I don't think they understand what the word fascist means, because when you say fascist, people think primarily of Hitler, I think, and then people would say that fascism is an intrinsically right-leaning ideology. I'm not sure that's true, because here in the United States, because the literal definition of fascism is essentially a public-private partnership in authoritarianism, right? And in the United States, we are run by, at least currently, by leftists who use private industry like banks and social media to censor people and take their money away, right? And they're not right-leaning so far as I can tell. So from your perspective, is fascism intrinsically right-leaning, or is that a canard? Is that just not true?
No, I don't think that it's true. The real enemies from Adolf Hitler were from the right. For example, this assassination attempt against Hitler at the 20th July. These were right-wing people who were against Adolf Hitler, and I wouldn't call him left in a traditional way. He called himself as an extreme against both extremes, from the far left and the far right. But you find a lot of similarities with left-wing thinking. And of course, it's too simple to say that he was right-wing. And for this Antifa people, they're very stupid. For them to make it short, everyone is a fascist who's not far left. This is their definition of being a fascist.
Well, that's stupid,
Yes,
obviously.
yes, of course. And what you said about the fascism in the economy, this is exactly what I described before. And I wouldn't say that we go in the direction of new fascism today, but you see some similar points, especially in the economy. And this is what a lot of people don't understand. What is the difference between a free market economy on the one hand and a planned economy on the other hand? I think it's very simple. In a free market economy, entrepreneurs decide what to produce, but in the end, it's consumers' choice. We decide who will become rich. If you Google something, you make Larry Page and Sergey Brin rich. If you order something on Amazon, you make Jeff Bezos rich.
Mm.
Or if you buy a Tesla, you make Elon Musk rich. So it's in the end, it's consumers' decision. This is what means capitalism, and in the planned economy, politicians and government officials decide what to produce and what people should buy. And we go more and more in this direction. For example, in Europe, we have now, they forbid the combustion engine. What is a crazy idea? You know, we were very proud in Germany for our automotive industry, like Mercedes, Volkswagen, BMW. And I think it's a crazy idea to forbid the most successful product. Everyone should drive only electric vehicles. And this is a typical planned economy idea. Don't leave it to the consumers. I have no problem when someone says, I prefer electric vehicle, I buy a Tesla. Great. But if another one says, I prefer to buy a combustion engine, so it should be consumers' choice. And so we go in Europe, and I think also in the United States, more and more in the direction of a planned economy. Maybe they don't call it a planned economy, but in fact, I said this is what's the difference between free
Mm.
market economy and planned economies.
Yeah.
Uh, Politicians decide.
Well, some of the downstream effects of having that kind of, um, let's call it government infrastructure, is extremely bad choices that lead to really bad downstream effects. And the example in Germany, I think, is over the past 15 years shutting down your nuclear power plants. You had six, then you closed three, and then you closed two, and there's one, and they wanted for some time to close that. Frankly, energy and food independence are super important for a country. I don't feel like I need to explain that to people, but it seems like politicians do not understand that.
I see you're well informed about the crazy things that we do in Germany, and it's exactly true. First, they phased out nuclear power plants. What is, by the way, a crazy idea, because the same people tell us every day that climate change is the biggest threat and that the fight against climate change should be our priority. But if you think this way, the first that you should do to build more nuclear power
Hmm.
plants and not to phase them down, first thing. Then they phased out coal power plants. And then in Germany, they forbid fracking. And now the result is that we have to import fracking gas, LNG, from the United States, which is, of course, good for the United States, but a crazy idea to forbid it to do it in our own country and to import it now from the United States. And we import dirty electricity from coal power plants in East Europe countries. So this is typical when politicians think they are smarter, but they are not smarter than the majority of people. They are driven by ideology, and this is what Angela Merkel did. And of course, we have big problems now because our prices for electricity are so high as in almost no other country in the world. And some leading German companies, they leave now Germany. For example, BASF, what was the biggest chemical company in the world, they go now to China because they say first it's less bureaucracy in China than in Germany, and the other thing that the price for electricity is much cheaper. And so this is crazy what they do. It's a good example, by the way. They did it with the energy industry. They called it the energy turnaround, and now they do it with the automotive industry. The same things. Of course, you cannot destroy a strong country like the United States or like Germany from one day to the other. You can do a lot of crazy things, but sooner or later, it's the same. I have this example. Maybe, for example, someone is really fat, like 150 or 170 kilos, and then you make a diet, and you have a good body in the end, maybe 80 kilos, and then 1 or 2 years later, you forget why you became so slim, because you stopped eating pizza, stopped eating chocolate, stopped eating ice cream and all this stuff. So this was the reason why you lost weight and why you have a good body. And then you think, oh, well, I have no problems with my body. Why shouldn't I eat a pizza? You can eat a pizza, nothing will happen. You will not wake up the next day being fat again. And then you say, okay, no problem. I will eat another pizza, maybe 3 chocolates and whatever. And sooner or later, we know what will happen. It will not happen from one day to the other, but it can happen everywhere. And I have one country as an example. Venezuela. Venezuela was in the 70s one of the 20 richest countries in the world, one of the 20 richest countries. And they had a full democracy, free market economy. And then they started with regulation, more government. Of course, not from one day to the next, but during the years, the situation became worse and worse. And then they made a big mistake. They voted for Hugo Chavez. And the intellectuals all over the world, they were enthusiastic. They spoke about the socialism in the 21st century. But what happened? More and more government, nationalization, and in the end, they had an inflation rate from 1 million% a year. And now, today, 7.5 million people fled from Venezuela. This is 25% of the population. This is always what happens, socialism. And no, I tell you what is my idea or my theory. Compare it with a test tube. A test tube with 2 ingredients, state and market, or capitalism and socialism. And then I watch as a historian what happens if we add more state, as they did in Venezuela, for example, or what happens if you add more market. And in my new book, How Nations Escape Poverty, I have examples from countries who made the decision for less state and more market. And I will tell you a little bit about it, because I like to talk about, not about theory, but about history as an historian. And one country is Vietnam. Vietnam was in the 90s the poorest country in the world, poorer than all African countries. The reason, of course, first, they had this war, but not only with the United States. Before the war with the United States, they had a war with France, and then with Japan and with China. They had war with almost everyone. And after they won the war, they made a mistake, and they implemented the planned economy that was before only in North Vietnam, also in South Vietnam. And what was not destroyed by the war was destroyed by the planned economy. And they ended up as the poorest country in the world. But people in Vietnam are very smart. Even the so-called communists there. They understood that they were on the wrong track with this planned economy. And they started with free market reforms. They allowed private property, and they opened the economy. They welcomed investors from Asia, from Europe, from the United States. And what happened as a result? The number of people living in poverty decreased from 80% in 1990 to less than 5% today. I think this is amazing. This is only one of a lot of examples how nations escape poverty. It's no secret. It's pro-market reforms, capitalist reforms, private property, give more freedom to the economy. Of course, they call themselves, even today, a socialist country with a communist party, but don't believe it. I've been there several times, and I had lectures there at the universities, and I can guarantee you one thing. It's much easier to find a Marxist at a university in the United States or in Europe than in Vietnam, because they saw what Marxism means in reality, not in theory.
Sure. Yeah, that is a very interesting thing about Marxism. Anybody that's experienced it firsthand is not a fan, which should be kind of telling, frankly. But I want to go back to a couple of things on German energy independence, this reduction of nuclear energy, and then the ban on fracking and stuff like that, where you would get LNG, liquefied natural gas. So there are downstream effects that are in many ways tragic for other countries of policy like this. So in 2022, Germany got about 55% of all of its energy from Russia, one way or another, right?
Yes.
Either oil pipeline or LNG. And this was the result of, as you said, banning fracking, of shutting down nuclear facilities. And I don't think that the Russian invasion of Ukraine happens if they're not getting all of that money from Northern Europe, especially for fuel. Now, Germany says they've cut off all the deals with Russia, but that's not true, because they're still buying from the Yamal pipelines through Netherlands and Belgium. And still 43% of their energy is sourced out of Russia right now. Your energy is sourced out of Russia right now still, which is propping up their economy, because they probably would be bankrupt by now as a country if not for their energy reserves being pushed into Europe.
And you know, the worst thing is, you could know it before. I remember a speech from Donald Trump in the United States.
And they laughed at him.
He warned us in Trump. He said, you get totally dependent on Russian gas, stop this. And I remember there were our crazy foreign minister from the Social Democratic Party and his friends, and you can see it on video. He laughed at him. Trump, he's so crazy. He tells us we get dependent on Russian gas. So you could see it before. And we were warned also from Poland and other East European countries. They saw it. And yes, this was a kind of being blind, ideology driven. Of course, it has a lot of negative side effects. And what they think now in Germany, they want to do it all with renewable energies. What means for them with windmills and with solar energy. But in Germany, the weather is not so great that we have always the sun. It's not like in California or in Spain. And it's a crazy idea. And this is the reason why our electricity today is so much more expensive than in the United States. And this is a problem, especially for a lot of companies who need cheap electricity. So this is only an example that when politicians think they are smarter than entrepreneurs, when politicians think they are smarter than millions of consumers, it's not true. They are not smarter.
Definitely not. And we see, like, you mentioned South Vietnam. And look, it's one of the top hubs for textile production in the world now. A lot of the, I think something like 40% of the textile business that was in China has found its way into South Vietnam. And they're making so much money that actually China got rid of their import-export tax when it comes to South Vietnam. So they're almost operating like partners to deliver textile products to the world now. Frankly, I don't think China is very Marxist anymore either. They may have the authoritarian side of it, but as far as economics go, they don't really play that game very much anymore because it doesn't work, right?
Yes, let's tell me something about China, and I can recommend one book. This is new now, also, The Power of Capitalism, a new edition, The Power of Capitalism. I have a chapter about China, And I will tell you my opinion about China. I spoke about the Maoist time when 45 million people died as a result of the biggest socialist experiment in history. Mao called it the Great Leap Forward. By the way, when I had my lectures in the last 2 years all around the world, I asked all the people in the audience, have you heard about this at school or university, about Mao Zedong's Great Leap Forward, where 45 million people died? Almost no one had heard about this at school or university. This is the reason why I'm writing books like The Power of Capitalism. So, and then even in 1981, 88% of people in China were living in extreme poverty. 88%. This was what Mao Zedong did. But then they had a very smart politician, Deng Xiaoping. I admire him because he saw that this is a total disaster and he started free market reforms. He allowed private property and he opened the country. And he had the slogan, let some people become rich first. And this is the reason why the number of people living in poverty in China decreased from 88% to 1%. It was not because of the state, but in spite of the state. I have a good friend. He's an economist at the Beijing University. Today, it's not so easy for him. His name is Wang Chang. And I met him in Beijing, and he always told me, don't confuse it as our politicians do or as people in the West do. Our success was not because of the state, but in spite of the state. We came from 100% state, and then we reduced the power of the government. And this was the reason for success. But what's happening now in China in the last 10 years with Xi Jinping, unfortunately, he goes back to more government and less market. So this is they are on the wrong track now. They were very successful, very successful. It happened never in history that so many people escaped poverty as in China, but not because of a planned economy, but because of free market reforms and private property. And now they go again. It's the same that we said about Europe or the United States. They forget sooner or later why they became successful. And of course, now companies go to Vietnam. Some say leave China, escape to Vietnam. And I hope that they will not make the same crazy mistakes in Vietnam as they do in China today.
Yeah, certainly. And then talking about Vietnam, now we have, and you mentioned Venezuela earlier, we have Argentina, where Javier Milei has he's started disrupting government interference into people's lives in a big way there. I think Javier Milei in Argentina he's a very dangerous man to the powers that be in Venezuela, because the people there in Venezuela are now watching in real time how their neighbors are digging their way out of poverty and hyperinflation just by moving government out of the way, right? I mean, this is the kind of thing that starts revolutions in an area.
You're saying exactly the same. I said it 2 days ago in an interview in a German newspaper. When Milei will be successful, it will be the starting point of big capitalist revolution in Latin America. This is definitely what will happen. I've been several times in Argentina and in a lot of countries in Latin America. I met the people from Milei's party first time 2 years ago, and I was very impressed because I didn't know it before. This is the most successful libertarian movement in the world. And I remember when I heard first time the name of Javier Milei, I have this Google alert on my computer, and I saw a man called Javier Milei, and he spoke about me because they asked him, what are you doing this afternoon? And he said, I will go home and go on reading the book from Zitelmann, The Power of Capitalism in Spanish, because it's also published there. And I know he's a fan of my books, Milei. I spoke today about my new book, How Nations Escape Poverty, and I will publish it in Argentina in August. And Milei's spokesman, he's also an economist, he wrote the preface for the Argentinian edition, and I hope that Milei will be successful. And this is he believes in the teachings of Hayek, and Mises, and it's similar. Though this is the reason why my book is so important, How Nations Escape Poverty, because I have a chapter about Poland, and in Poland, Poland was in the 80s one of the poorest countries in Europe, and then they had economic reforms by an economist, Austrian School of Economics. His name is Balcerowicz, and he believes in the same theories as Millet. They are very similar, not in the personality, but in their belief system. And they read the same books, they believe in the same theories. And you can learn something from Poland. And this is the most important thing that I will go back to Argentina maybe in August, and I told it in a lot of interviews in newspapers in Argentina. Be patient, because what happened there in Argentina, the bad things, happened over decades. 100 years ago, Argentina was one of the 2 or 3 richest countries in the world, similar to the United States. And then they started with this Peronist politics, and with more government, more socialism. And in the end, it was a total disaster. And now, of course, you can't change things that went wrong over decades. You can't expect someone to make reforms that will work in 3 months or in 6 months. On the opposite, on the contrary, in the first step, this is a lesson that I have in my book about Poland. Some things will even become worse. For example, hidden unemployment becomes open unemployment. Today, you have people in Argentina, they are employed from the government, but they do absolutely nothing. And Javier Milei will kick them off, fire them from their jobs, because they are not real jobs. They do nothing. And so this was the same in Poland. Hidden unemployment becomes open unemployment. And of course, that's such a restructuring of the economy. In the first step, some things will become worse. And when people are not patient in Argentina, and they lose patience after 6 months or after half year, and or after 1 year, and they say, "Yeah, we elected you to make things better, but now things become worse." I said it in the preface for the Argentina edition of this How Nations Escape Poverty. I told them, you can choose between 2 things. First, you're patient with Millet. You wait 2 years or 3 years that things become really great, and then you can become one of the greatest countries, not only in Latin America, in the world, if you go on this way. The other thing, you are not patient. You go back to this perilous politics, and then everything will be as bad as it was before. And it was really bad in Argentina. You have to know that since 1945, there was only a few years where they had no double-digit inflation rate. Imagine this thing. I'm born in 1957, and I think you're also even younger. All of our life, we would have only double-digit inflation rate. This is what happened in Argentina. There was only a few years in the 90s where it was better. And 40% of people in Argentina live in extreme poverty. So this is the result of this politics. So I hope very much Millet, I will meet him here in Germany in June, because I have a lecture at the same event as his, and then I will see him in Las Vegas. He comes to Freedom Fest. By the way, I can recommend everyone join Freedom Fest in Las Vegas in July. It's great. Millet will also be there, and I will be there. It's a great. I don't know. Have you ever been there at this event, Freedom Fest?
No, I've never been. No.
It's great. You can Google it. Freedom Fest. There are 2,000 or 3,000 people, mostly libertarian people, free-thinking people from the United States who go there. It's really a great event.
Yeah, I've seen I've seen it before. I've just never been. Yeah, to the point of Argentina, there when Millet was when he first took office, the monthly inflation rate was 25%. That's monthly, per month, 25% per month. Now it's down in single digits again. And they registered a surplus for a couple of the months in this year so far, which is nice. Yeah, it's like that's a dangerous proposition for the people that want to continue to run authoritarian governments, particularly when it comes to the economy in those areas, because it has been. Look, it's my opinion that all forms of government eventually become ways to extract labor and wealth from the population, and maybe that's just inevitable to some degree. And I'm not an anarchist by any stretch of the imagination, but in the United States, we pretty much decided from the very beginning to have a weak, ineffectual federal government. That was the plan. Unfortunately, it didn't work out that way, right? We kind of fell asleep at the wheel on that. But you can see the results. I mean, there's so much data over the past, let's call it 120 years or so, on side by side, like parallel economies, communism or socialism versus capitalism, and which ones have done well. And then you look at the periods, the up and down periods of capitalism, and you can always tell when there's a valley because there's so much government interference. So like the 2007, 2008 housing market crash in the United States was primarily due to legislation that Barney Frank, who was a congressman here, wrote in the late 90s. And it had a lot to do with these subprime mortgages being bundled into tradable securities and things like that. But this was all government doing this stuff. And
Absolutely. This is what people don't know. They tell you this financial crisis and the house price bubble was caused by too much market and deregulation. No, it's wrong. It's absolutely the opposite. It's a result from all this regulation. They forced financial institutions and banks to give people to loans who should never get any loan at all because they have a bad credit history and so on. This was caused by the government. But of course, the leading interpretation, the mainstream interpretation is that the financial crisis was caused by too much market and by not enough regulation. This is crazy. I mentioned this book, The Power of Capitalism. I have one chapter in my book about financial crisis, and I saw that it was so much regulated. It's crazy if people tell us that there was not enough regulation. No, on the opposite. But you see, since the financial crisis, it's good that you mentioned it, more and more people all over the world believe capitalism does not work. We should have more government. And if I compare it with the 80s, it's completely different today all over the world. In the 80s, there was a collapse of socialism. People understood that socialism did not work. It collapsed everywhere in the Soviet Union, in Eastern Europe, in China. I mentioned this Deng Xiaoping started with free market reforms. It was the same time when we had Ronald Reagan, who, by the way, was for me one of the best politicians in the 20th century. We had Ronald Reagan, we had Maggie Thatcher in the UK, Deng Xiaoping in China, in Poland, Balcerowicz, and a lot of people understood that capitalism is better. But now 40 years or 30, 40 years later, people forget it. And we have a movement all over the world that goes exactly in the opposite direction. In Latin America, it's almost completely governed by socialists, with the exception now from Argentina and some smaller countries like Uruguay, Paraguay, but Brazil with the socialists, even in Chile, what is crazy, because Chile was the most successful capitalist country in Latin America, but even they voted for socialists, the same problem. They forget why they became successful. We talked about Venezuela, even in Colombia, everywhere it's socialism. And I spoke about China, that they go back to more government now. And in the United States, in Europe, it's the same way. This is the reason why I'm writing my books and why I have all these lectures all over the world, because I think we have to start a counter movement. And the problem is that young people, they should learn it at school, what social means and what capitalism, but they don't learn it. They learn about the so-called evils of capitalism, but they learn absolutely nothing about socialism. And And if I ask young people only about one number, I ask them, have you heard that before capitalism, 200 years ago, 90% of the worldwide population lived in extreme poverty. Today, it's less than 9%. Less than 9%. This is what capitalism did. And no, we never heard about it. They don't know anything about it. And so I'm writing my books now. And by the way, I can also recommend I produced two films. You can get them free on YouTube. The first film is Life Behind the Berlin Wall. I compare East Germany, West Germany, and the other film is Poland from Socialism to Prosperity. You can get both for free on YouTube. It's only like 20-minute movies. But so I try to do a lot to as an historian to educate especially young people in a way.
I wonder about this because, and I'm thinking back into like the 1950s and 60s with Iran. It seems like this push towards either fundamentalism or more state control or whatever, right? Socialism or communism. It pops up a lot when a country either discovers they have natural resources or they find a new way to exploit their natural resources for revenue, or they want to bring that money back into the state. Like Iran started their anti-Western movement because they wanted a better deal from OPEC on their oil. They didn't want the British being involved in that, so they just went full crazy, right? Completely destroyed all the Westernization that had happened in their country. Chile voted for socialist governments right around the time that rare earth minerals like lithium and cobalt came into high demand on the global market, and they have quite a bit of it down there. And infrastructure also to start mining it right now, which a lot of people are getting involved in. Venezuela with their oil reserves and things like that. Eventually, it turned into state power trying to capitalize on all that money. I mean, I think of Saudi Arabia; they do the same thing. Kuwait, there's some countries, Kuwait, that have oil revenue sharing with their citizens and stuff like that. But it seems like there is a direct link between either finding natural resources or market growing for the natural resources you have, and being able to exploit them that makes these people turn. And then I wonder if the government isn't ahead of that a little bit, and then they start propagandizing people like, oh, what we really need is a utopia. But what a utopia really is that the state keeps all the money and everybody else lives in poverty.
To be honest, I never thought about it this way, but it's interesting. I will think about it. And in a way, it's plausible because there are two ways to make money. The first is if you rely on natural resources, this like oil or gas, as in Russia or in this Middle East countries. Or the other thing is entrepreneurship. And entrepreneurship can never be done by the government. The government is not a good entrepreneur. Can only be done by private companies. And you see a country like Germany, we have not so much natural resources, but we became very successful because of entrepreneurship. Mm-hmm. And Russia, on the other hand, there's no country that has so much natural resources as Russia has, oil and gas and almost everything. But their GDP was even lower than from Italy, even before the war started. So this is because they have no culture of entrepreneurship. And this is the most important thing. In reality, capitalism means entrepreneurship, and the state can't do it. The state can only if they have oil and gas or natural resources, they can sell them and make money with them. And this is yes, no, it's interesting. It makes sense what you said. I have to think about it.
Yeah, let me know what you come up with on that. In the meantime, let's get back to your book. So. How nations escape poverty, Vietnam, Poland, and the origins of prosperity. Are you looking in this book at the success of Vietnam and moving away from socialist stuff, and then how's Poland involved in that exactly? Because I'm not too familiar with their economic system.
Yes, let me tell you. First of all, both countries have a lot in common. Mm. They had both terrible wars. Poland lost more people in the Second World War than any other country, of course, adjusted to population, but they lost more people in the Second World War. And then after the war, Vietnam and Poland both implemented a planned economy. And it didn't work there as it didn't work in no country in the world. People also in Poland were very, very poor. They were poorer than the Ukraine, and an average Pole earned in the 80s $50 a month, 50 US dollars a month. They were very, very poor with a lot of debt, a high inflation rate. And I have it in my film, I have it in my book, that people had to stand in the 80s in long, long lines, in long queues, even to get a pair of shoes maybe or something to eat. They had to wait hours and hours, sometimes even days. I have it all in my book, even days. It was the same in Vietnam and in Poland. And then in both countries, they started with free market reforms. In Poland, it was in 1990. In Vietnam, it was in 1986, but it took a couple of years till they were successful then in Vietnam. But so it's a very similar story. The only difference is in Vietnam, it's still a one-party system. It's not a democracy, of course. It's no freedom of press. And in Poland, they had also the shift from a one-party system to a democracy. But in all other things, it's very similar. And this is the reason why I took both of these countries together in the book, because you can learn a lot from them. You can learn that what helps is, I gave you this metaphor or picture from the test tube, where you add more market and you see it's successful. Poland now, since 3 decades, is Europe's growth champion. They are so successful. Standard of living increased dramatically in Poland. And so I start my book with one chapter about Adam Smith and his book, The Wealth of Nations, because last year there was the 300th anniversary of Adam Smith, and I was proud because I could write the article in the Wall Street Journal at this day about Adam Smith, and the topic for my article in the Wall Street Journal was that Adam Smith showed us what is the way to escape poverty, and it's very simple to understand. Adam Smith said in his book, the only way to escape poverty is economic growth. Number one. Next thing, the only way to have economic growth is economic freedom, not government, economic freedom. And I think it was great that he thought 250 years ago in his book, and he was proven right. And the next chapter in my book is about development aid, because if you ask anti-capitalists, if you ask leftist people, what should we do against poverty in Africa, for example? Their answer is, we should give them more aid, more development aid. But it didn't work. I showed, based on a lot of scientific studies, that development aid did not work. It goes not to the poor people, but in the pockets of corrupt elites in these countries.
I mean, we just saw that in Ukraine, right? So there's a report from this week, actually, that shows quite a bit of the money we've sent to, I'm sorry, not Ukraine, to Gaza. Quite a bit, like something like 40% of the money we've sent to Gaza has never made it to the Gazan people. It's like, yeah, of course it hasn't, right? Because that never works. It never works to send people handouts like that, because whomever the tough guy in charge is going to steal that shit. That's how it always goes down.
Absolutely. This is what always happens in Africa and everywhere. And you see, who got the most development aid in the world? Africa. And it's still the poorest continent. In Asia, they got by far not so much development aid, but they had their economic reforms. I mentioned China, I mentioned Vietnam, but there are other countries like Singapore, very successful, Taiwan, extremely successful, or South Korea, another example. I've been there several times in South Korea. In the 60s, South Korea was as poor as all African countries today. But then South Korea decided for the capitalist path, and they're very successful, one of the leading export countries in the world, and you see their huge shopping center. And in North Korea, people are still starvation and hunger. It's so easy to understand it, and you see it if you look in history that always people moved from socialist to capitalism, not the other way. It was in Germany when we were divided. People went from east to the west.
Mm-hmm.
They had to build the wall because almost 3 million people went from the socialist east to capitalist west, and then they shoot everyone who wanted to escape. In
Mm.
North Korea, it's the same. I never heard from someone who want to go from South Korea to North Korea to find their better life. Or you see it from Cuba. I never heard that people from Cuba that people want to go from the United States to Cuba, maybe for a 2 weeks vacation, because they have great weather there, maybe. But I never heard something. I want to improve my life. Let's go to Cuba because it's better. They know. They go from Cuba to Miami. They go from East Germany to West Germany. They go from North Korea to from North Korea to South Korea. They go from Venezuela to Chile. And I don't understand why it's so complicated for people to understand it. You see it if you open your eyes.
Mm. Yeah, I mean, it's a good, maybe this is reductive to some degree, but a pretty good standard to tell if a country's doing well is if people are fleeing from it or to it, right?
Yes,
That seems like a pretty easily, not just objectively obvious, but also easily measured, right? So,
yes,
I mean, as far as tests go, now back, you mentioned Adam Smith quite a bit in this book. Um, the economic freedom part is so important for so many reasons. Like these people who want the government to be in charge of everything just don't, for some reason, can't understand this. That extra motivation comes from people being invested in their own future, right? Having control over it, having my physical hands, and this is certainly part of Australian economics, liberty or libertarianism, but I can use my hands to create and make a new life or a better life for myself and generations to come. So they believe they can rise in station or class. We call it upward mobility, right? In economic terms. People who don't believe that, who aren't invested in their nation's economy, who don't believe they can work their way out of where they are, they're not going to be creative. They're not going to work hard. Usually what happens is they create parallel illegal economies like the Italian mafia or whatever, right? That's here in the United States. And that's why a big part of the president's job or prime minister's job is to simply inspire economic confidence, right? You have to convince people that working hard and doing the right thing is going to have a real benefit to your life. And when you do that, I mean, G.K. Chesterton said this in his writings about Rome back in the day, that men didn't love Rome because she was great. Rome was great because the men loved her, right? I mean, that's how it has to work. It has to work just like every other physical structure in the entire world. It's built from a strong base upwards. And for some reason, these people want to have this halo of government over their heads all the time, disseminating downward. And it doesn't make any sense. I mean, it's never worked in the history of human beings.
it's good to hear people like you, and I think there are a lot of statists today, also in the United States. But I have hope that in the United States there are people like you who spread this message. And if you do it and I do it, the big problem is that entrepreneurs who should defend capitalists, they don't do it. In a way, sometimes they are afraid to be cancelled from this woke leftist people. Sometimes I understand they are focused on their daily business, what I can understand. They have no time to get deeper in these things. But this is the problem. The problem is not this left-leaning ideologist. The problem is that we have not enough people like you and me who defend capitalism. And so it's good that you do this job. It's good to hear people like you. And I hope I can be several times. You can always reach out for me, and I would like to talk about this topic. So it's a good feeling for me.
Yes, sir. Same. I really appreciate the work you do. So before we get out of here, everyone go check out the book, How Nations Escape Poverty. Vietnam, Poland, and the Origin of Prosperity. Then there's The Power of Capitalism, which has a new edition out as well. And
Yes.
then In Defense of Capitalism is a good book. And there's two films you can find on YouTube. One, Life Behind the Berlin Wall, that'll give you perspective on the idea we talked about, which is use as a metric whether people are fleeing to or from an area, and because that's usually all you really need to know. And then Poland, from Socialist to Prosperity, is another kind of, I guess, probably would read the book How Nations Escape Poverty first and then watch that film. That's kind of how I'm planning on doing it. So thank you for coming today. We really appreciate your time and all the work you do. Hopefully people can stop being idiots, I guess. I don't know how to say it. Like, I try to be polite about it, but if you think the government's coming to save you, you're crazy.
I appreciate it. I love to have more talks and good. I see what I knew before. In Texas, there are a lot of smart people. Thank you.
Yes, sir. Thank you. And thank you all for listening. This has been Citizen.